now. Okay, so welcome to the seminar series for Department of Languages and Linguistics, the Centre for Research on Language Diversity. So I'm really pleased that Andries Coetzee has, I hope I've said that okay, is that, that's all right, okay. That's
very close.
Okay, well you say it and I'll try it again.
Andries Coetzee.
Oh, Andries Coetzee, okay. Has made the effort to stay up extra late for us. This was meant to be a little bit earlier today, but we had to reschedule, and I'm really grateful that it's close to midnight for him. So he's here with us today. Andries received his BA in Classical and Semitic Languages from Northwest University at South Africa, and he also did honours in Semitic Languages and in Theology there in South Africa, and eventually an MA in Semitic Languages. He then went to the US and did an MA in Linguistics at the University of Massachusetts, and eventually he did his PhD in Linguistics as well at the University of Massachusetts, which, you know, some of you here may know is a very strong phonology department in the US. Straight after that, pretty much, he landed where he is now at the University of Michigan. Is that right? Yep. And so he's been there since 2004, but he holds various honorary positions in Africa and Japan. He is a member of the editorial board of Literatur, Language Learning and Phonology, but he's also the editor-in-chief of Language, which is the flagship journal of the Linguistic Society of America, and as some of you may know, one of the most highly ranked journals in linguistics. I've admired his work for a long time on sort of on tonogenesis, on various natural and unnatural processes in sound change, the relationship between perception and production in sound change. You know, given how much I've enjoyed his work, I'm really glad that he's able to come and talk to us today about something that I don't think it is sound change, is it? It's more, no, it's not sound change. It's just Afrikaans as it's spoken in Patagonia, and it's a more broad-ranging talk. So thank you very much for making time to come and talk to us, and we look forward to hearing from you now. I'll put myself on mute and let you go. Share your screen.
Thank you very much for that introduction, and thank you for inviting me into your homes or offices or wherever you are. It's really great that I have this opportunity to talk with you about this project. So yes, my career since finishing my PhD has really focused on two kinds of research: very theoretical abstract phonology, and then more recently kind of in the more theoretical side of phonetics, what Maria has just told you about, you know, sound change and the relationship between speech perception and production, but from a fairly theoretical vantage point. Today, I want to talk to you about something that's not like that at all. It's a newish research direction for me. Maybe it's the last 4 or 5 years, and it is the first time that I've really ventured into language in the real world, that messiness of language situated in an actual real word situation. So since it's relatively new for me, I would really very much appreciate input from you all, because I think in this audience we have people who have done more of that kind of work. I found it to be, you know, simultaneously very intimidating, but also very interesting and satisfying. So I think I might, for the next foreseeable part of my career, focus on this kind of work. So the specific topic I want to discuss is this expatriate community of Afrikaans speakers in Patagonia, Argentina. And why do I want to look at this community? Well, there's many reasons. For one, I have a kind of identity connection with this community. They are an immigrant community living in a world where the people around them don't speak Afrikaans. And, you know, for the past 22 years of my life, I've been an immigrant living in a society where people don't speak my language, Afrikaans. So I felt this connection with this community. They're also a community that is really well known in South Africa. If you grow up there, as a speaker of Afrikaans, you know about this community. And I've always been intrigued by them and wanted the opportunity to learn more about this community. And what a privilege it is to be a linguist, that one can combine such personal interests with professional interests. So about 5-6 years ago, we started exploring this community. And it's a fairly large research project. So this is just the main participants in our research group doing this research. We were funded primarily internally to the University of Michigan by the Humanities Collaboratory. So a large research group that brings together people across the humanities and the humanistic social sciences to explore topics. So our team is looking at this community in Patagonia, both from a historical anthropological perspective. So we have half of the team that does kind of history anthropology, interrogating the identity of this community. And then the other half of the team works on the linguistic side. And that's obviously where I fall, and that's the work that I'll be talking about today. So what you see here on the screen is just the main collaborators. We have 6 professors involved in the project. We had a couple of postdocs, PhD students, and probably 30 undergraduate students that over the years have worked on various parts of the project. So nothing I'm talking about today is work that I've done by myself. It was all done as part of this large collaboration. And the 3 people there in the red box, those are the 3 main linguists on the project. So we are the people who were really centrally involved in the projects I will be talking about today. So it's myself and then my 2 colleagues, Nick Hendrickson and Lorenzo Garcia Amaya from the Spanish department here at Michigan. Right, we couldn't do this project without each other. I don't speak Spanish, so I provided the Afrikaans knowledge for this project. Nick and Lorenzo don't speak Afrikaans, but they speak Spanish. And we needed both Spanish and Afrikaans to pull off this project. So let's step a little bit further back and ask the bigger question of why. Well, one of the many reasons why this is an interesting community to study, and the part of the project that I want to focus on today. And this is the fact that this is a community whose heritage history comes from migration. Now, migration is a fairly universal human experience. There's been large human migrations since the earliest origins of human society. And that makes it interesting to study such communities with migration as a definitional part of their identity, to try and understand that aspect of the human experience. If we think about the scenarios under which large-scale migrations happen, it's often at moments of disruption, right? It can be because of climate-related disruption, whether it be floods or droughts, or times of political unrest or war. And because of that, when these migrations happen, there's often not very accurate record keeping, right? If you are migrating to get away from a climate disaster or a war, you're not going to focus on making sure that you keep accurate records about what happened, right? You are doing this for the sake of survival. And that means that often it is difficult when we look at migrations that happened far in the past to understand exactly what happened. What we are trying to do, well, one of the things we're trying to do in this project is to see if we can use linguistic evidence to augment an incomplete historical record. So this particular community that we're studying in Argentina, they had their origin 120 years ago at the end of a war between the British and 2 independent Boer republics in South Africa. And the photos at the bottom of the screen here are, more than 120 years old, so they're not the clearest photographs, but they show the conditions under which these people were living towards the end of the war, and then the conditions they left when they migrated to Argentina. So on the left-hand side, see the concentration camps where the British put the women and children in, and on the right-hand side, not a very clear photo, but can see, farmsteads being burned down. So the British had the scorched earth policy where they burned down the farms. So these people were leaving behind economic and security disruptions, and therefore just didn't care that much to keep record of where they came from in South Africa and what's the conditions under which they left. And at the same time, the British didn't care very much because, you know, they were just kind of too happy to have these people leave who didn't want to live under British rule. So not very complete historical records about the origin and the conditions under which they left. And we're asking, can we use linguistic evidence to try and fill in some of those gaps? So a bit more brief history about the community. So towards the late 1800s, the thing that we think of as South Africa today, the political unit, didn't yet exist. So there were two British colonies, the so-called Cape Colony in the southern region of South Africa, and there was the colony of Natal on the east coast. So these were two British colonies. And then in the interior of what is today South Africa, there were two Boer or Afrikaans republics, the Orange Free State and the South African Republic. And initially, these two Boer republics and the British colonies existed in, you know, a fair amount of peace. But towards the middle of the 1800s, that changed. And there were multiple reasons for that change. Gold and diamonds were discovered in the interior of what is now South Africa, and the British wanted access to that. But it was also just part of the British colonialist program. So they had this desire, and Cecil John Rhodes, which was one of the leaders of the British colonialism, he had this idea that there should be British soil from Cape to Cairo, so from the southern to the northern tip of Africa. And at this point, that was true, except for this little interruption of these two Boer republics. If those could be British soil, then they would have had continuous British land from Cape to Cairo. So there were two wars between the British and these two Boer republics. The first one in the 1880s, and the British lost that war. But then the second war, the so-called Second Anglo-Boer War of 1899 to 1902, the British were victorious in that war. And it's at the end of this war that this migration happened of roughly 600 to 650 Afrikaans speakers who left what is now South Africa and migrated to Patagonia in Argentina. Why did they leave South Africa? Well, up until this point, the Afrikaans speakers, or the Boers, in order to get away from the British, just moved further north in Africa. But at this point, further north wouldn't have helped because directly north of them was already British territory. So it was either accepting British rule or leave Africa. So why did they go to Argentina? That is not really a big surprise or an accident. At the same time period, the Argentinian government was actively recruiting European settlers, typically from the colonies, European colonies in the Southern Hemisphere, to populate the Patagonian desert. So the Patagonian desert at this point was mostly uninhabited. The Argentinian government had a program of decimating the indigenous population of that region of Patagonia. And it was actually closer to Chile, and the Chileans were starting to cross the Andes, and Argentina was worried that Chile would annex this part of Patagonia. So they wanted to populate it and were therefore recruiting settlers from European settlers from the colonies in the Southern Hemisphere. So at the end of the war, the Argentinian government sent an agent to South Africa to recruit immigrants. And then the government paid for their passage to Argentina and gave them land. And this is how these roughly 650 speakers ended up in Argentina at the end of the war. So between 1902 and 1906 is when they went there. So one of the questions that we're asking in our research is, where in South Africa exactly did this community come from? There is limited historical evidence, limited records about that. So we know for about 50 of the speakers where they came from. There's records of one of the boats that went over, of the passengers on the boat that listed where in South Africa they came from. And they came from, some of them in the, these two republics that lost independence from the British. That's not surprising because these were the people whose political situation changed and were therefore unhappy with British rule. But that's not the only region in South Africa where Afrikaans is spoken. It's also spoken in what is now the Cape Colony. And we know that there were also some Afrikaans speakers, especially in the northern regions of the Cape Colony, who were also fighting in the war against the British. And historical records show us that some of the settlers did come from that Northern Cape region. But we only know for about 50 of the 650 where they come from, and we know some came from these two original republics and some came from the Northern Cape region. But we don't know where the majority of the community come from. For historical reasons, one would assume the majority would have come from the two republics that lost independence to the British. But they might also have come from the Northern Cape region because these were also Afrikaans speakers who didn't like British rule. So what we want to do in this study, one of the things is to ask, can we look at the way that Patagonian Afrikaans is spoken today and look at the dialectal distribution in South Africa and see if we can match which dialect regions in South Africa Patagonian Afrikaans agrees with more, and can that maybe help to tell us more about the geographical origin of these speakers from the early 1900s. So as I've mentioned, there's about 650 speakers who went over between 1902 and 1906. Our research team visited this community the first time in 2014, and the data I'm talking about today is what we collected in 2014. At that point, there were maybe 30 or 40 speakers left, and they were mostly older, 70s, 80s, or 90s. So we are at the end of Afrikaans in this community now, which is actually surprisingly long, right? So Joshua Fishman has this famous model of immigrant languages that shows that typically these languages survive for roughly 3 generations, so 60 years. So by the 3rd generation, knowledge of the language is gone. In this Patagonian community, we are now at 120 years since the community started, and in the 4th and 5th generation, and only now is the language coming to an end. So the reason that it survived that long is not all that surprising. When they settled there originally, it was in a very isolated region of Patagonia in the middle of the desert, and they were a functionally Afrikaans monolingual community for 50 or 60 years. And only in the 1950s and 1960s, this large numbers of Spanish speakers moved in when commercial oil drilling started happening in that part of Patagonia. So if we start counting in 1950s, 1960s, then the Fishman 3-generation model 60-year time frame applies. So it seems like it depends on when intensive contact with the majority language started happening. But the good thing for us is now that we are dealing therefore with an expatriate immigrant community where the language is still alive 120 years after original settlement, meaning that we can maybe use linguistic evidence to peer more than a century into the past of this community. So a little bit about the dialect distribution, dialectology of Afrikaans in South Africa today. So this map here is modern South Africa with the 9 provinces that's part of South Africa now. And the 3 shades of gray show the 3 main regional dialect areas of South Africa. So the large swath in the east, or the northeastern variety of Afrikaans, that's where these 2 Boer republics were. And that's the majority variety of Afrikaans, the variety you'd find mostly in schools and in the media. Then there's a separate dialect area in the Northern Cape region, and then also a separate dialect area in the Cape Town, the southwestern region of South Africa. I'm going to focus today on the northeastern variety, so spoken in the parts of South Africa that lost independence in the war with the British, and then the variety in the Northern Cape, because this is where we know the war with the British happened and where we know at least some of the settlers, the Patagonian settlers, came from. There's a lot of differences between these 2 dialect areas, the Northern Cape and the northeastern variety. There's a difference in the ethnicity of the speakers. So the northeastern variety is spoken predominantly by white speakers, whereas in the Northern Cape variety, we have a more mixed ethnic makeup of the speech community with both white speakers, but also non-white speakers. In addition to the difference in the speech community, the ethnic identity of the speech community, there's also just a host of morphosyntactic, phonetic, and phonological differences between these 2 varieties. And that's what makes it possible for us to look at Patagonian Afrikaans and ask with which of these two varieties does it agree with more, and maybe that tell us something about where the settlers came from. So there's many different features that we can look at, and in our research group, we've been exploring them kind of sequentially, slowly working our way through the data. I'm going to talk about 3 today, 2 of them phonetics, phonological, and then 1 from morphology. And if there's time, I'll do syntax, but I think I'll run out of time today before we get to syntax. So let's jump into the first one of these phenomena, and that is going to be, what we're calling velar palatalization. So what do we mean by velar palatalization? This is a process by which the velar plosive k can, get this palatal off-glide, and it happens when that k stands before high front or mid vowels, so before e, e, and schwa vowels. And this is something that differentiates these 2 dialect areas. We see the velar palatalization apply in the Northern Cape varieties of Afrikaans, but not in the Northeastern varieties. So what this means is in the Northeastern variety, a velar plosive is always just a plain velar plosive, irrespective of what vowel it stands in front of. But if we're in the Northern Cape varieties, we have this palatal glide showing up when the velar plosive is followed by a front, high, or mid vowel. So in the Northern Cape, we have, like for the word for child, which is kind, would have kind with the palatal glide inserted, whereas in the Northeast, there isn't a palatal glide, it's just kind. So here the 2 varieties differ, but when we come to, for instance, back vowels, the 2 varieties are the same, just plain velar plosives, koek and koek for cake. So what does Patagonian Afrikaans do, right? Does it look more like the variety in the Northeast of South Africa, or is it more like the variety in the Northern Cape? So what do our data look like? We collected data in this speech community in Patagonia. So this was our first trip. So this was a smaller data collection trip. We have since been back there, and on the first trip, we recorded data, as you see here, from 14 individuals. The second time, we did about as many again. So I think we now have close to 30 speakers, which is nearly the whole speech community we have now made sociolinguistic interviews with. And you see the mean age is fairly old because the remaining speakers are all fairly old. And then we collected similar control data from Potchefstroom in South Africa. So that's up here in the region of South Africa where the Northeastern variety is spoken, age matched roughly 10 speakers. We should have recorded also data on the Northern Cape. We didn't to begin with because we assumed that the majority of the speakers would have come from this part of South Africa that lost independence to the British. So going into the project, we thought it would be reasonable to collect control data in the Northeastern region of South Africa. We have since figured out, as you'll see during the presentation, that it seems actually that there's more agreements with the Northern Cape variety. So we have last year, just before the pandemic hit, collected data also in the Northern Cape, so in this region over here on the West Coast. And it's been transcribed and we extracted phonetic and acoustic information, but we haven't yet analyzed it. So I can't report on the Northern Cape data, but I can tell you impressionistically what we've seen in the Northern Cape data. That data should be all processed and finalized in the next few months, and then we can start pushing out some publications on this. Okay, so our data were all sociolinguistic interviews. We extracted all tokens of a velar plosive followed by one of these vowels that can trigger velar palatalization. So you see it's between 500 and 700 tokens for the Northeastern variety of South Africa and then the Patagonian Afrikaans. For this project, we were looking at change in first and second formant during the vowel. And the idea is that evidence for palatalization will be a rise in first formant from the onset of the vowel into the vowel and the fall in the second formant as you enter into the vowel, right? So the idea is you come out of the palatal glide into the vowel and that transition from the palatal into the vowel that follows, if there's a palatal glide, we should see a rise in first formant and a fall in the second formant. So what do some examples look like? So here is just the vowel portion of the word kinders, which means children, as produced by a Patagonian speaker on the right and the speaker of Northeastern Afrikaans, so collected in Potchefstroom on the left. And then you see the first and second formants listed there. I can play them to you quickly, and if you listen, it's a very short sound clip, but if you listen carefully and focus on the, the initial plosive, the South African variety is just a plain velar plosive, and then in the Patagonian variety, you should be able to hear, hopefully, the palatal glide in here. So here's the South African speaker.
Kinder, 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 kinder.
And then the Patagonian one.
Kidders, 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 kinder, kidders, kinder, kidders.
I don't know if it really comes through very clearly in this recording. But if we look at what happens with the first and the second formant here, what we see is, I've just overlaid kind of straight lines. In South African Afrikaans, it's fairly flat. Whereas in Patagonian Afrikaans, we see the second formant falling during the vowel, and there's a slight rise in the first formant also during the vowel, right? So this is what we are going to look for as acoustic evidence for this palatal glide. Sorry. So that's a Patagonian speaker and a Northeastern South Africa speaker. So I've just thrown in here one quick example from our Northern Cape data. And also in the Northern Cape variety, you see the fall in the second formant and the slight rise in the first formant. So the Northern Cape variety also has this evidence of the palatal glide. And I think the Northern Cape variety, actually, you can hear in this token, maybe that gliding better. Right, it's a kienish. Okay, so that's the phenomenon we're after here. So what did the results look like? So let me orient you in terms of what you're seeing here. So this is first formant trajectory during the vowel. The black lines are for Patagonian Afrikaans, and the two lighter gray lines are for Northeastern South African Afrikaans. The solid lines are in stressed syllables and the broken lines in unstressed syllables. So what do we see? Well, we see there's a steeper rise in the first formant for Patagonian Afrikaans than for South African Afrikaans on average. And it also seems like it is a little bit more extreme in the stressed than the unstressed syllables. So there's more evidence for first formant rising in Patagonian Afrikaans, more evidence for this palatalization. If we look at the second formant, so again, the black lines are Patagonian Afrikaans, the gray lines, South Africa, and then the solid lines, the stressed syllables. So we see a fairly steep fall in the second formant for Patagonian Afrikaans, a fall, but not nearly as steep in South African Afrikaans. And again, maybe a little bit more extreme in the stressed and the unstressed syllable. So what does this tell us? This tells us that there is evidence for more extensive velar palatalization in Patagonian Afrikaans than in the Afrikaans of this northeastern region of South Africa. And this means that in this regard, Patagonian Afrikaans is more like the Northern Cape variety than this northeastern variety. Now, I said what I unfortunately don't have is similar representations of the data from the Northern Cape. In about another month, I should be able to show you that. But the Northern Cape variety agrees with Patagonian Afrikaans in this regard, with the rise in F1 and the fall in F2. So what does this mean? This could mean that maybe the majority of the speakers came from the Northern Cape region rather than from this northeastern region, from these two, once upon a time independent Boer republics. It can also mean that at the time when they left South Africa, the regional distribution of this variation was different than what it is today in South Africa. And that's a real possibility because when they left South Africa in 1902, Afrikaans wasn't yet recognized as a language, right? It was only in 1925 that the South African government recognized Afrikaans as a language, made it an official language, and replaced Dutch with Afrikaans in the school and in government. And together with that officialization in 1925, also came a fair amount of standardization, right? They had to pick a variety of the language that was going to be the official variety for which they wrote textbooks and translated the Bible in and started teaching in schools. And whenever that happens, one does find a loss of some variation. So it is possible that this gliding variety had a wider distribution in South Africa in 1900. In 1925, the non-gliding variety was selected as the official version. And as a consequence, the gliding variety kind of, withdrew and is now only found in these outlier border varieties like in the Northern Cape. To answer that question, we would need, to get acoustic evidence from 100 years ago. And I'm still hopeful that I can maybe get recordings from the 1930s, 1940s to maybe help us answer that. But for the time being, what we can say is Patagonian Afrikaans sounds more like Northern Cape Afrikaans as spoken today in South Africa. So let's look at the second phonetic case study, that of lowering. So this is another feature that differs between the northeastern variety of Afrikaans and the Northern Cape variety. And this is a process whereby the vowel is lowered to a when it stands before r, l, ch, or k. And this is a process that we see applying in the northeastern variety of Afrikaans, but not in the Northern Cape variety. So what this means is before sounds other than r, l, ch, and k, the two varieties have the same vowel, right? So for the word for knife, both varieties have mes and mes, lem and lem, vet and vet, and so on. But if we look at words where this vowel is found before r, l, k, and ch, the two varieties differ. In the Northern Cape, we still have the mid vowel e, and then in the northeastern variety, that vowel lowers to an a, right? So now we have different vowels. So that will be differences like, if you look at the word for stretch, the Northern Cape will have rek, and then the northeastern regions will have rak, right? So we go from e to a, you have this lowering happening. So we can again now go and look at Patagonian Afrikaans and ask, which of these two patterns do we see in Patagonian Afrikaans? Do they have this lowering of e, which would make them like the northeastern part of South Africa, or do they lack that process, which will make them more like Patagonian Afrikaans? So the data comes from the same sociolinguistic interviews previously discussed, and then we just extracted all of the occurrences of e vowels from these two groups of interviews, and we're looking at first and second formant at just vowel midpoint. So this is a project where we have just finished coding and extracting the data. So what I'm showing you here is just raw F1 and F2 measures from vowel midpoint. I haven't yet done statistics on this, but this is a case where I think the pattern is clear enough that yes, we need to do statistics, but statistics is kind of confirmatory to just show that the patterns that we clearly see to be there are actually there. We don't have to do statistics to help us identify the patterns. So let me orient you in terms of what you're seeing here. On the top panel is the Patagonian speakers. The bottom panel is the Northeast South African speakers. And then the ellipse in red is this e vowel when it stands in this context where the lowering can be triggered. So before r, l, k, and ch, and the blue ellipse is when it stands elsewhere in a context where we don't expect the lowering to happen. So what's the patterns that we see? Well, for Patagonian Afrikaans, so the top panel, we see these two ellipses really overlap quite significantly. And there isn't clear evidence of two distinct categories. So you couldn't just based on the identity of a vowel decide in which context they appear, right? It's basically one category. There's maybe a little bit of evidence for centralization before r, k, and ch, but the main pattern is one of overlap between these two. If we look at the speakers of the northeastern variety of Afrikaans in South Africa, we see these two ellipses don't really overlap. And there's two clear separate clouds of tokens, right? So before rilke and ge, we see both lower and centralization of the vowel. So very clearly two separate categories. So again, then this is an example of where Patagonian Afrikaans looks like the Afrikaans of the Northern Cape and lack this lowering process, which differentiates them from the Afrikaans in the northeastern regions of South Africa. So we now have two features where Patagonian Afrikaans is like Northern Cape rather than the northeastern variety. Okay, let's look at one example from morphology. And here I want to look at the plural formation in Afrikaans. So let me first teach you some basic Afrikaans nominal morphology. Afrikaans has several different ways of forming noun plurals. The two most productive ways is by adding either an S suffix or a schwa suffix. And to some extent, which suffix you have to use is predictable. So for some words, some nouns, based on the final sound of the noun root, you know it has to take an S or a schwa suffix. But it's only partially predictable, right? So if you look at the examples here, the word for bird ends on an L and it takes an S plural, right? So the plural for bird is voels. And the word for ball also ends on an L, but it takes a schwa plural, it's balle, right? And similarly, the word for banana is pisang, ending on a velar nasal, and it takes the S plural. And the word for hallway also ends on a velar nasal, but it takes a schwa plural. There's even a small number of nouns where either suffix is possible, right? So the plural for man can be manne or mans. So what this means is when you learn Afrikaans, you really have to memorize the plural suffix. It's to a large extent idiosyncratic. And we know from the research in the heritage language, immigrant language research area that it's exactly this kind of morphology that heritage speakers often struggle with, right? So these unpredictable idiosyncratic aspects of inflectional morphology is often parts of the morphology that is either not acquired or through attrition is lost. And especially in a case like the speakers that we are working with, these are speakers that have been living primarily in Afrikaans for the past 50 years, in Spanish, for the past 50 years of their lives, and have really very little opportunity to speak Afrikaans. So it's these idiosyncrasies of the morphology that is sometimes lost. So this is the pattern that one would expect to find in the northeastern varieties of Afrikaans spoken in South Africa. What do we see in Patagonia? Well, in Patagonian Afrikaans, we notice generalization of the S plural. So nouns that in South Africa should take a schwa plural, we sometimes find in Patagonia taking the S plural. So here are just three examples that I kind of randomly picked from the interviews where I would say restaurante, and we hear the Patagonian speakers talking about restaurants. I would say cliente, and they have clients. I would say tente, and they have tents. So we see a generalization of the S plural taking over where a schwa plural is to be expected. This is another thing that I haven't yet gone through all the interviews, find all the plurals, count the numbers, so I can't report frequencies here, but it's frequent enough that as a speaker of Northeastern South African Afrikaans, that was something that really stood out to me as I was doing the interviews with these speakers. So is this something that we also find in the Northern Cape region? I haven't yet, I don't think so, right? So listening to the interviews we did in the Northern Cape, I didn't notice this generalization of the S plural. There is, however, a specific variety of Northern Cape Afrikaans known as Orange River Afrikaans. And I will soon tell you a little bit more about that variety, where we see the same thing happening, the generalization of the S plural. So here are three examples, luipaards rather than luipaarde, diers rather than dier, diere, bergs rather than berge. So the same generalization of the S plural where in the northeastern variety of Afrikaans, we would expect the schwa plural. So what is Orange River Afrikaans? It's a Northern Cape variety of Afrikaans, but unlike the variety that we've been basing our generalizations on, our study on, we were working primarily with white speakers in the Northern Cape region of South Africa because our Patagonia community are primarily, well, exclusively white. Orange River Afrikaans is a non-white variety. It's not spoken by white speakers. It's spoken by the so-called Griqua people. The Griqua people are descendants of the Khoisan people, so the original inhabitants of the southern tip of Africa, the first indigenous people with whom the Europeans made contact when they settled in South Africa in the 1650s. And they adopted Afrikaans as their primary language, now mostly only spoken in very small rural communities in the Northern Cape region. A fairly different variety from the white varieties of Afrikaans. But there is quite a number of features that is shared between Orange River or Griqua Afrikaans and the Northern Cape variety as spoken by white Afrikaans speakers. And this probably has something to do with the fact that the socio-ethnic interaction patterns in this very rural, remote part of South Africa is different than when you move into the major population area. So there was always more interaction between the ethnic groups in this rural Northern Cape region than you would find in the northeastern regions where Northeastern Afrikaans is spoken. So it might just be that there's more shared features because of more contact between these varieties. Another reason why I think that this Griqua variety of Afrikaans might be relevant to the Patagonian case is, together with the 650 Patagonian speakers that we know left South Africa in 1902, there were 2 black men that were taken by these white settlers with them to Patagonia. And these 2 black men, the only 2 non-white people who were going, went to Patagonia. Well, they didn't go there. They were taken there probably as, forced laborers. Their names, Damboy and Kokolas, are Griqua names. So this gives us some expectation that there was contact between Griqua Afrikaans, Orange River Afrikaans, and the Afrikaans of the Patagonian speakers. So another example of where there's agreement between Patagonian Afrikaans and a variety of Northern Cape Afrikaans, and it puts Patagonian Afrikaans apart from the Northeastern variety. Now, this is a place where we really have to think about possible influence of Spanish, because in Spanish, the standard way of forming a plural is adding either an S suffix or an ES suffix, right? So we know virtually all Spanish nouns pluralize with an S at the end. So the fact that we see a generalization of the S plural in Patagonian Afrikaans might also just be, extending the Spanish pattern into their Afrikaans and may not reflect, something carried over from the Northern Cape region. And I think this is a real possibility for this plural case, exactly because it's an unpredictable, partially idiosyncratic feature of Afrikaans grammar, and because these speakers for whom we collected our data from have, they basically stopped speaking Afrikaans when they turned 20 and moved into town and have lived in Spanish for the past 50 years of their lives. So they've just fairly little opportunity to use Afrikaans, and therefore these idiosyncratic features they might lose, and the Spanish pattern might generalize into the way they speak Afrikaans. Okay, so let's conclude. What we have then seen is 3 shared traits between Patagonian Afrikaans and Northern Cape Afrikaans, right? So Patagonian Afrikaans is more velar parallelization. Patagonian Afrikaans lacks this air lowering process. And then Patagonian Afrikaans has this generalization of the S plural. And all 3 of these are things that we see in the Northern Cape region. What might this mean? Well, it might mean that the majority of the speakers came from the Northern Cape region and not from the Northeastern region, which is counter to what one would expect based on the origins of this community, because it's this part, the Northeastern part, that lost independence to the British. And we would have expected that's where the settlers came from. But linguistic evidence points to maybe the majority having come from the Northern Cape region. Or, as I have hinted at, it might also mean that the dialectal distribution in South Africa in 1900 was different than what it is today when we were collecting our data in South Africa. And it's possible that the variety that we now find only in the Northern Cape was spoken more widely in South Africa 120 years ago than it is now, and that it was the standardization that happened after officialization in 1925 that pushed these, which became the non-standard varieties, to the fringes of the speech area where Afrikaans is spoken. Anecdotally, I think that is a real possibility. I think about my grandmother who was born in 1910, 1911, and who spent her whole life in this far northern portion of South Africa. I feel like she showed some of these features that is now Northern Cape features and Patagonian features. But that is really anecdotal evidence, right? To figure out if that's actually what's happening, we need to get our hands on acoustic data of Afrikaans, from as far back as we can, preferably before 1925 when standardization happens. I don't think there exists anything before 1925, but I know there are recordings from the 1940s. The South African Broadcasting Corporation started recording their news and other programming in the 1930s, 1940s. And I know they have in their archives in Johannesburg some of those early recordings. I have more than once filled out the paperwork and paid the money to get access to these recordings, but I've never actually gotten them. And the main reason, the only reason every time was that there's fairly high, it's a state organization, fairly high turnover of staff. And by the time that my requests were processed, the person that I submitted it to no longer worked there. But I haven't given up. I really would like to get access to the earliest recordings I can to see what the distribution of these features were 50, 60, 70 years ago in South Africa. Okay, I think I will stop here and then indeed not talk about syntax. Thank you.
Wow, thank you. That is fantastic. I'm just going to pause the recording for now.